Welcome
Hello
back.
and welcome back. Oh, Sriram,
Oh,
wow.
crap.
Beautiful start to this podcast. That couldn't we have to
Horrific.
keep that. We have to keep it in now because
Of
it's
course.
we if
Couldn't have
people
got
think that
better.
that the fight site is some well-oiled machine like run and with specifics, they're like, "Oh, they're so
Hmm.
diligent with their podcast release dates." This should just dismiss all that.
Naturally. I mean,
Um
that was entirely planned.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, like that was rehearsed.
Nailed
We
it.
are joined with another guest this week as quarantine continues. Our good friend Michael Fiedel. That is how you say your last name, correct?
I know.
Fidel. Damn it. Well, you're close enough.
No, I've
Michael
gotten
is
a lot worse.
Michael. Yeah, I'm sure you've had people just butcher your name.
Oh yeah.
Michael is an MMA journalist, an official one, which us at the fight site we are not. Except for Ben. I think Ben might have his. I don't know if he has his journalist. Does he have his journalist major? I don't know. But the topic that we're going to be talking about this week is a pretty interesting one, and it's the difference between like MMA journalism and MMA analysis, and how Michael does his job. MMA, as we know, is a squeaky clean sport. Everyone in it is just super classy, and there's no kinds of corrupt ties at all. Nowhere in the sport will you find any sort of corruption. And so we're gonna talk about how Michael Michael does his job because it's very different from how we do ours. And we're also going to talk a little bit about the difference between what an analyst does and what a journalist does, and just kind of get his thoughts on this. So before we start, Michael, how's quarantine going, buddy?
Well, I'm definitely very fortunate during the quarantine. Thankfully, I'm still living at home with my parents because I'm a young gun, so I don't have to worry about paying for a majority of services that a lot of people do. Um, so school was moved online, and in that sense, it's been a little bit easier because the professors have kind of loosened their expectations and requirements. I actually just finished my last week papers and exams, but as of that, I am done with school for the remainder of the semester. And other than that, things have been good. I've been trying to get some working out in because freshman 15, but other than that, just kind of biding time.
Nice.
Good, as much as you can hope for. Are you a
Yeah.
freshman in college? I didn't know.
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, you are? Okay. My mistake. For some
Oh, no
reason I thought
worries.
you were older. Maybe it's just how you carry yourself in interviews, which is always very professional.
Well, thanks
Which
very much.
actually kind of carries into something I've talked with you about before. I think you would say, Michael, that you've interviewed some colorful personalities in MMA, would you not?
There's a broad spectrum, yes.
And you do a remarkable job of keeping yourself very poised and mature and democratic, even-handed in interviews, which can be very difficult because there are a lot of things, a lot of aspects of fighters that the UFC either just tries to bury, just ignores. Um, and it's a pretty, as Julian on our staff made a video of, MMA is pretty grimy. Do you agree?
I apologize. You cut out for the end of your question there.
Sure, I just said MMA is it's a pretty gritty sport. Like there's a lot of dirty ties in a bunch of different organizations. So how do you navigate all of that as a journalist?
Friendly. So, MMA is definitely a sport that has rough edges. It is not as sanctioned or as regulated or as above board in every facet as I think most people would like. There's a lot to be desired when it comes to the ways in which the sport is conducted, transparency, and things of that nature. So when it comes to issues around corruption, shadiness, kind of misdeeds or misconduct, I think as a journalist or as a media member in general, it's very very important to be your approach, because one of the live transparency is a lack of understanding, even from a journalist's perspective. When I ask a subject a question, it's not because, like a lawyer might, for example, I know the answer and I'm trying to get them to say a specific thing, either to confirm a suspicion or to entrap them later on. These questions, from a journalistic perspective, are to genuinely find out the truth. Now, of course, not everyone is honest with what they say, so that has to be taken into account. But the question I'd make is that asking questions and going into an interview without expecting a certain result is very important. For example, I've gone into stories where I clearly thought a promoter had committed a wrongdoing based on what a fighter or staff member had told me or did towards me in communications, and the promoter has revealed detail on have nation in a new light. So when you want to talk about covering the sport and dealing with some of the gritty aspects, as you put it, I think it's very important to be unbiased, not only in your published work on the subject, but in your investigation of the subject as well.
Yeah, I think that's it's a very ethical way to articulate your point. Well said. And I applaud you for that. And this is something I've applauded you in the past as well, because it can be kind of hard to do that at certain points. Like it can be a little bit difficult to play a fair and honest hand with people who are, who have connections to murderous dictators, or domestic abusers, or people who are charged with these types of heinous acts. That it's there's got to be a part of you that probably wants to just that wants to ask them the questions that are going to put them in the position where they're going to have to confront what they've done, or just speak the truth. But I am very impressed, and I have been impressed with your work in the past as someone who just doesn't fall into that trap. You really do your best in interviews, from what I've seen and what I've heard, to get the truth from these people, to get the truth from the fighters, to really just find out the answers.
Yeah, thank you. And that's definitely a subject worth expounding on. For example, it is important to kind of hold those with positions of authority's feet to the fire. It is important to ask serious questions about serious things. You mentioned relationships with, for example, dictators, with Ramzan Kadyrov, for example, in Chechnya. Kadyrov has he has his own gym, Akhmat Fight Team. He has his what is essentially his own promotion after merging with ACB, his promotion WFCA, to form ACA. He has influence with fighters who are outside of his promotion or outside of his team due to the geopolitical situation he finds himself in and the strength of that region in producing talented fighters. These are figures that exist in MMA, and to ignore them because someone is talented at grabbing an armbar would, in my opinion, be a dereliction of duty from a journalistic perspective. However, I think it's also important to kind of keep your own spin out of things. For example, I, like everyone else, have my own morals, my own values, my own principles, and my own opinions. But as a journalist, I don't think that my opinions, my values, my morals, my principles are superseding anyone else's. When I write a piece, or if I perform an investigation or ask a question, it should not be my kind of viewpoint that governs any of those things. It should be trying to come to the root of the issue, the facts of the case, and presenting them for the audience to take as they will.
And I think personally, I think you do that very well. I don't know if much of the much of the rest of the MMA media always does that. I think a lot of them have a tendency to maybe just ask the easier questions. But Sriram and I are also in a very unique position because we are not in the same position that you are, Michael. Like we are analysts. Like I guess that is our if we can assign
That's
ourselves
the
titles.
niche.
Yeah, that's the niche. And like journalism versus analysis when it comes to MMA and combat sports, they're not the same thing at all. And I said to Sriram, the third prong would probably be something like betting. You know, if you were going to cover, you know, people were covering the sport, there's got to be someone who analyzes the sport for what it is, someone who, you know, asks the questions and investigates the sport, and then someone who's able to, you know, make these kind of evaluations for betting and gambling purposes. And so I guess between the three of us, we cover 2 out of the 3 of those things. But we don't have to worry so much about what we write or what we say, mainly because the fight site is privately run, and we were, you know, 2 of the first ones who were asked to join it. So there's no one, you know, we don't have anyone sort of telling us what we can and can't publish. And I guess my question for you is, do you feel like you have anything that you've been asked not to publish, or, you know, have people, you know, you don't have to reveal specifics, but have people, you know, asked you or to keep things off the record between them, or how does the privacy kind of work for you in your line of work?
Certainly. So as would refer to yourselves as analysts, and I think that is a very apt description, and I'm very thankful for your guys' role as analysts, because A, it makes my job much easier if I can just read what you guys write and parrot it. But B, it's also a niche that I'm not equipped to handle. I don't have extensive training, or I don't watch the fights with the same kind of analytical view that you guys maintain most of the time. So it's not really my lane to perform technical analysis, and for that reason, I kind of avoid it. As for the kind of access versus adversarial balance that you spoke about, I think that's a very important one, especially in MMA. For a lot of media members, access is the most important thing that they can maintain from a professional and financial perspective. MMA is a sport that, although we'd like to believe it's in the mainstream, has yet to truly cross over into mainstream the same way some of the other major force sports have. In that sense, the audience is much smaller. So for reporting on the sport and for media on the sport, the best way to drive audiences to your site, or to create ad revenue, or to advance yourself in the world of media, is to gain favor or keep favor, or neither of the two, but a sort of general understanding with a subject that allows you to get exclusive news or to report on popular fighters or popular going-ons. That's why you see exclusives with fighters generating the most views for websites. It's why you see some of the aspects, like, for example, MMA Junkie's Blue Corner, where they focus on out of the cage kind of exploits, and they generate massive amounts of views because those are interesting things to people. However, what I would say to your latter point of kind of a journalistic buffer, which an editor might say, don't publish this, don't publish that, or where a journalist might fear for revocation of their access, I have not personally experienced much or any of that. Thankfully, like yourselves over at the fight site, the Body Lock is privately owned. And Jake Nichols, who brought me on way back when, I believe October of 2018. So it's been just over a year and a half, has been nothing but incredible as far as an editor can be. He has never once vetoed a story or said, don't pursue that. And I think that's a product of our situation within MMA media. Obviously, the Body Lock is not one of the biggest sites in the sport. We're not an MMA Junkie and MMA Fighting and ESPN, The Athletic, but we have this ability because of that. We are not big enough that we need access. And obviously, we're not big enough that we deserve access from a lot of outlets. We don't have access to a lot of promotions, to a lot of fighters. And that's both a blessing and a curse. We don't get an exclusive with Conor McGregor. We don't get access to, say, an Israel Adesanya But what we do get is the ability to not fear losing that access. And what that allows us to do is cover things that some sites don't or won't touch, or some people don't feel are worth the return on investment. I know you guys are very familiar with Mike Skype. I love that guy. Terrific Asian MMA coverage. If he were to work at, say, an MMA fighting or an MMA junkie, his lane of coverage, Japanese MMA, might not be prioritized in the way we feel that we do at the Body Lock, because it doesn't generate the views for a US site that it would for a Japanese site. So by not being such a large site, it obviously has its drawbacks, but it definitely has its pros as well.
Yeah, I've worked with Jake too, and I think I'm still there. It's just that without the actual fights going on, there's not a ton for me to say. But
Right.
Yeah, Jake's amazing, and that's something that I feel I have to say as well, because he brought me on a while ago too. It's been a long time, and he's the Body Lock's amazing. And one of the pieces there was the one on Ali Abdelaziz by you, Mike, and it was terrific. And I think that really does make your point on how, like, probably MMA Junkie and MMA Fighting wouldn't run something like that because they need all of Ali's fighters, because that's like half the roster in multiple promotions. But
certainly, yeah, I would hesitate to say that they wouldn't run it or don't run it specifically for that concern, because obviously not editorial decisions, and both outlets have reported on negative aspects concerning Abdelaziz and other positions of power. For example, the lawsuit currently facing Dana White regarding the sexual components. All those major sites did report on that, which goes against the theory that I just presented. But I would say that there is a hesitancy. So unless it is something that has been reported elsewhere, or unless it is something that is concrete, something that the risk reward, the cost benefit analysis does take place. But specifically pertaining to that Abdelaziz piece, that's something that I feel Jake allowed me to write, and we decided to write because we did not prioritize access to Abdelaziz or his fighters over what we believe to be factual and ethical reporting with that piece. I have not had many Abdelaziz fighters knocking at my door or texting me wanting to do interviews or appear on podcasts, and we knew that that was something that might be possible. But I have spoken with Abdelaziz fighters in the past, and I intend to in the future. It's just one of those things where I feel as though adversarial reporting or factual reporting should come before access. And I say that from a position of privilege, where the site that we have does not have access to begin with and doesn't need it in order to do what we do within our niche.
Interesting that your own, like, the fact that you are a smaller, independently run outlet basically kind of grants you a specific sort of freedom that you wouldn't otherwise have.
Absolutely.
I guess I hadn't really thought about it like that, because like I said, Sriram and I, we never have to worry an ounce about what we publish. Like all of the works that we publish on the fight site are basically come from either, there's a small amount of demand when it comes to like staff picks and so forth, but most of what we do, it is entirely in our hands, what we want to write, how we want to write it, when we want to put it up. And it's just, this is such a different lane that you're in, and it's just kind of fascinating to hear the perspective of someone who has to be, who has these sort of like bigger minded questions on, like, about private access, and like, what you would lose if you moved up, say you got brought on to ESPN or MMA Fighting someday, how would your aspect change, I guess, is what I'm asking.
Yeah, it's definitely a great question, and something I've thought about a lot as I've advanced to my college years, because as you know, I'm pursuing a degree in communication studies, as the school I attend doesn't have a journalism degree outright that falls under the communication studies banner. But I've also been looking towards internships and positions over the summer, things of that nature. And a lot of that has been informed by the type of coverage I do now. and the type of coverage I might have to do depending on which site I would join or in what capacity I would join. Because I can be very frank and say the type of coverage I do is not very endearing to a lot of sites. It rocks the boat at times. It doesn't generate the most views or the most clicks. So it's not going to be a massive moneymaker. It's not something that is very well suited to the current environment of MMA media. And that's something I've thought about quite a bit. It's something that I am okay with, I accept, because I'm happy with the type of coverage I'm working on. But I would quote J.E. Snowden. I know he has his fans and detractors on social media, but he posted a tweet saying, and of course, he's a senior writer at Bleacher Report. He's come out with two very prominent books, the Ken Shamrock one, which is coming out soon, and the MMA Encyclopedia. So he is a seminal original author of MMA content and is someone who is still prominent within the space with Bleacher Report. He came out with a tweet much to the same effect and said, adversarial reporting is not the way MMA media works right now. So if that is your lane, it is not something that is likely to be very conducive to future job opportunities. Luke Thomas has echoed the same thing. But even though that is the case, I feel comfortable in what I'm reporting. I feel comfortable in the way that I'm reporting it. And it's what I enjoy to do. Well, enjoy is a difficult word, but it's what I find to be a productive use of my time within the journalism space. But like you said, if I were to go to another outlet, how would that affect my writing? Ideally, it wouldn't. Ideally, I would be able to do the same kind of coverage and the same kind of style of reporting that I currently do. However, I'm very aware that under Jake and with the Body Lock, there are very different editorial standards than what we would face at a major corporation's media outlet or a major high-level outlet. I'm sure some of my stories would not have been allowed to go further because the cost-benefit analysis doesn't work. And not even from an adversarial perspective, but I've written plenty of pieces that have generated tens of views, slightly over 100 views. I prefer to write a lot of content that doesn't seem to be very accepted by a wider casual audience.
I applaud you for that. I really do. And I think it was the interview you did with Greg Hardy a few months, actually more than a few months ago, many months ago. And what impressed me about that is that you asked questions about his past, about the domestic abuse in Greg Hardy's past, and you put the ball in his court. You know, you weren't accusatory, but you asked him if there was anything that he wanted to address about his past, that, you know, this was the chance to do it. If he wanted to, apologize, or if he wanted to, say his piece or whatever it was. And, he evaded the question, which I think was fairly predictable. But it was the fact that you didn't immediately jump at him with these big accusatory questions, but you also didn't just let him off the hook either. Like I think both of you knew exactly what you were asking, and even though you didn't get an answer, I think everyone on Earth would have expected him to say nothing. I don't think anyone was expecting you to get an answer. I don't even know. Were you expecting to get much of an answer from him?
So I wasn't expecting to get much of an answer, because not only is that a very difficult subject for anyone to address, and it's something that even if he wanted to address it, it would not have looked good to address it unless he were to come out with something we had never heard before. But it's also been played out. We've heard him answer these kinds of questions for years now. So what I wanted to do there was kind of, like you said, put the ball in his court. I didn't want to accuse him of things he's been accused for years. I didn't want to go over the same details we'd heard before. I genuinely wanted to hear how his approach has changed over time, if there was anything that he felt he could do to win over fans, or if there was anything he felt was unfair to him. Because like I was saying earlier, I have my own opinions, my own morals, my own principles, my own values, and my own beliefs about certain things. But that's not what's important from a journalistic perspective. It's the subject's beliefs, the subject's morals. So I wanted to put the question in terms that would allow him to go in whatever avenue he chose to pursue. And we found out which one he pursued very quickly. But it was very interesting to ask him that question and interact with him both before and after the interview.
Now I'm curious, what happened after? Like after the interview shut off, how was the discussion between you two?
It was very
you
cordial.
Okay.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, certainly. Nothing was off the record. It was just an interaction between a journalist and a fighter without any kind of strings. I was introduced to him by one of the UFC staff who was overseeing the media day that was held last March at American Top Team. He said, "Excuse me, Michael, would you like to speak to Greg?" I walked over. We conducted our interview. And after the interview, if you've seen the American Top Team gym, when you go in the front door, there's a large space where the fighters train in groups. And then there's a cage on the right side once you enter the door for sparring and the like. And we were kind of in the space between the cage and the large training area. So it forms this like almost hallway of sorts that leads back towards the main area. We conducted the interview in the middle there for noise. It was a media day, so other interviews were going on. And after we finished the interview, the last question pertained to his past. It was one of the more charged questions, not only of the day, but of that interview, I'm sure. We concluded the interview. I shut off my microphone and camera, and we walked out of the hallway together, shook my hands, and went along with his day. So obviously, I can't speak to his entire life or all of his behaviors, but my interactions with him were cordial and curt, excuse me.
So, would you say, given that interaction, that like the fears of these major outlets losing access is somewhat? I mean, it obviously depends on the manner of questioning, and you've kind of kept it as neutral as you can, which is the best way to do it in like multiple ways. But would you say that, given how Hardy reacted, being like a particularly controversial member, that more media can afford to ask these sorts of questions to other fighters and managers and such?
Yeah, I think it's definitely a difficult kind of area. I view it more as a tightrope walk between on one side you have access, and on one side you have the quote unquote tough questions or things that might make a subject unhappy or frustrated with your interviewing, and less likely to do an interview with you in the future. So a lot of people walk that tightrope where they don't want to lose access, but they want to ask tough questions. And I don't fault anyone for their type of coverage. Everyone has a different perspective on things and a different purpose behind their questions. And everyone has a different situation with their job. I'm very fortunate with the position I have with the Body Lock, where I can ask those questions and I won't lose my position. I won't lose the salary I depend on to feed myself or a family. But I think with Hardy specifically, he's been dealing with these questions for so many years and to a much more difficult extents than the way I posed them to him, that I feel as though for him that was a routine way to handle an interview, especially because since coming to MMA, those questions restarted. The process restarted of facing so many media members with so many questions yet again, and the kind of press he receives. So I feel as though with Hardy, because the issue has been around for so long and been discussed ad nauseum with him and without him, I think he was less affected by it. So I wouldn't say that that necessarily is the norm when you ask someone a difficult question, but I would also say that in my experience, I've tried to ask tough questions or meaningful questions to anyone whenever relevant. I would say that recently Bloody Elbow did an interview with Chael Sonnen, who is still planning on holding his Submission Underground 13 event on April 26th. Despite the coronavirus pandemic and the cancellation of UFC 249. And they asked a question, I believe it was something along the lines of, how would you feel or what would you do if this doesn't go well, if the worst case scenario were to happen? And I distinctly remember that Sonnen's answer included, wow, you dug deep with that one. I didn't know you were going to ask that. And then he provided one of the most candid and relevant pieces of information in the entire interview. So I think there is a point and there is a reason to ask questions that are relevant, regardless of the effect they might have, because I think sometimes people are much better at understanding neutrality and understanding a journalist just doing their job than we give them credit for. Those are the two examples I can think of right off the bat.
That's I think all that's pretty rich information. I gotta say, I'm a little bit surprised that Chael Sonnen turned out to be as candid as he was. That's the thing, is I maybe this is just residual from the fact that Sriram and I are still, and the rest of the fight site staff, except for, Ben, who conducts interviews, like, we're all a few steps removed from personal interactions with these fighters. I think any
Right.
interactions that any of us have had with fighters have all been like passing comments or tweets at the most. Like, we don't really consider that much. All the information that we get from them in terms of who they are just kind of comes from interviews and
Right.
and sort of what the fights tell us, because that's what our lane is. That's what we study. So it is interesting. It's unique to think about it in terms of, how do you pose these sorts of questions, and like, what kinds of answers are you expecting to get back? Because that's just not, like, Sriram will tell you the same thing. That's just not the stuff that we really have to think about.
Yeah, no, certainly. It's a different lane, and they're equally valid, equally important in the MMA scene, as I believe the question that we're going to tackle today will reveal that they are equally important and vastly different lanes. But I think it's very important to understand that as the Ultimate Fighter Season 1 showed us, these fighters are people too. They have very complex lives, very complex emotions about things. They're not all sound bites and in-cage performances. And I'm certainly not saying that either of you believe that about these fighters, or that that's what you said at all. But I think there's a perception from a lot of people to just read a headline or to see a quote out of context and draw assumptions about people, or throw them under a bus, or in the opposite light, to hold them up as standard bearers in ways that they may or may not deserve. But I think it's very interesting when you have conducted an interview, or you've seen an interview conducted, to see the way in which they work. There are certain fighters and certain media members who have very different approaches to interviews, very different approaches to media. Like, for example, Hannah Cyphers, who has been in the UFC for, I believe, 3 fights now, is very media shy. She does not enjoy being in front of the camera as much as a Chael Sonnen might. And that informs the way in which her interviews take place. And of course, given that the media is writing the interview after the fact or uploading it, that informs people's opinions of her, or of the way that she speaks, the way that she is. And of course, there are opposites to that, and there are exceptions to every rule. But I think it's a very different world to be in once you are.
Yeah, you mentioned the question that it's from a patron of the fight site, Mike Jarsulek, and it's kind of generally about combat sports journalism versus analysis. But I think the more interesting way to look at it might be that they shouldn't have as big a division as they do, in the sense that, for example, if you look at people like Ariel Helwani and pretty much everyone in the mainstream, like big shows about MMA, except for Luke Thomas, it's kind of treated more like pro wrestling than it is an actual sport, because it's like, as you mentioned, Mike, it's not necessarily like having an analytical eye is like necessary to follow the sport, and there are like multiple ways to be interested in it. But do you find it more necessary for these sorts of personalities to actually follow the fights, as opposed to just the the backstage stuff and the personalities?
Yeah, I definitely think it's important for media members to, first of all, watch the fights, but also pay attention to them in a way outside of, oh, so and so won by first round knockout. And I'm certainly not saying that's the case for any of the people that you named. But what I would say is that MMA is a sport in which there's so much to understand, so much to learn, and so much to pass along when you speak or write about fights or fighters, that it becomes more and more important to do so, especially if you're someone who gets involved in fighter predictions or matchmaking or analysis outright. See, personally, I don't believe that I am equipped to do the kind of analysis that you guys at the fight site do from a technical perspective. If I were to watch a fight, I would very, very rarely be picking up on pivoting or the way fighters are cutting off the cage or turning out of corners, all of the things that you guys point out every time, especially given my own background. I have a very limited experience in jiu-jitsu, three-stripe white belt, haven't trained in several months due to injuries, moving, and now the coronavirus. I don't feel well equipped to break down grappling the way other analysts or jiu-jitsu competitors might. So in that sense, I kind of avoid that lane, or I only offer my opinions on things that I feel confident in or that fit the description of the question I'm being asked. If it's fighter picks, I give my picks and I keep my mouth shut. I'm not going to try and break down a fighter's Muay Thai capabilities because I don't know much about Muay Thai. And I think that's a failing on my end in that I should, but it's something I don't know about. So it's something I try not to speak about often as a source of authority or expertise. But I also think that there's a lot in MMA to cover outside of just the fights or just the technique. So to say that media members have to perform analysis in that way is something I feel is not necessary. So what I mean by that is there is a market for the business of MMA, as you see with guys like John Nash, Jason Cruz, Paul Gift, who do the finances of promotions and the legal dealings with promotions, and they deal in that field. So I think that's just as valid as the fights themselves, sometimes even more so when you look at giant issues like the UFC antitrust lawsuit or One Championship's finances. So in that sense, I think it is important for media members to be aware of what they're covering if they are going to talk about it and posit themselves as experts on that subject. But I also think that there are niches that can be utilized in which that is not necessarily needed.
I want to add something because as you said, the two can inform each other, but I should say they don't always, because
Right.
oftentimes analysts discard things that we see from journalists because in most cases it fails to inform our own conclusions. So, an example was I'm not going to be able to find the link, but I think I saw a headline somewhere that was quoting John Jones before the rematch with DC at UFC 217. Or 214, excuse me. And he said something like, John Jones takes inspiration from Damian Maia, wants to mitigate damage in his approach, or something to that effect. And so, I think the response from a lot of, I hate to use the word casual, but I'm going to do it, more casual fans was to look at that and say, oh, well, that might not be good, man, if he's trying to change his whole style up. And I think the analysts, we all kind of looked at each other and we're like, yeah, no, he's probably just going to be John Jones the same way he's been John Jones in the past, and he's probably going to win because he's better. And that was the conclusion that we drew. And like whatever I saw from that link and I saw from the work that these journalists did, like I personally just kind of discarded it when I saw it. Like I didn't really consider it too much in my analysis and my conclusion. And I think we have a habit of doing that sometimes. Whereas I think the two can inform the other. I think they are more hand in hand than we might see. It doesn't mean they're identical, and it doesn't mean that they have to be the same. But in my experience, that's just maybe just a theory as to why there's a bit of a division between MMA journalism and MMA analysis. Is that for analysts, like I said, I'm sure Sriram probably agrees with me that we sometimes just discard things that we see from journalists if they don't really inform our own conclusions. And even if we're wrong, it doesn't necessarily mean that we our failing as analysts was that we didn't take into account something that a journalist wrote. Sriram, what do you think?
Yeah, I think like most of it is just that, it's closer to pro wrestling than we might want to believe, and that a lot of them are just, kind of saying things to promote the fight. So if someone's like, "Oh yeah, I'm going to go out and knock him out," well, we learned from Israel Adesanya at 248 that that's not necessarily the tack that they're going to take in the fight. So like, as for the most part, it kind of stays isolated because the only way you can tell what's going to happen in a fight in the future is fights in the past and not what they say. But I mean, it also cuts the other way in that, for the most part, analysis doesn't really have anything to do with the journalism that most of the major media outlets do. So, like, for example, if I were to say, like, John Jones's style has changed a lot, and I could say that in like an analytical piece, but it's not really something that like MMA fighting is going to cover because that's not how it's informed. It's more on, what has John Jones done lately, which is invariably very, very bad things. So, yeah, they can inform each other, but for the most part, I agree that they don't.
That kind of went through all my questions. I mean, the only last thing I'd say, Michael, is that I really do applaud you because everything I've read from you and seen from you, you are very diligent and very even-handed in how you approach these things. Like I studied journalism in college, and when I was done, when I graduated, I knew that I didn't want to do journalism because for a lot, not MMA journalism specifically, but just journalism in general, for a lot of the same reasons that you pointed out. It's, like it can be hard to stay even-handed. It can be hard to have to, deliver these fair, even if they are charged questions, if you're looking for a specific answer. And you are someone who, you've come in contact with people who, you may not like them very much as people. Most people probably wouldn't. Unfortunately, there's a lot of personalities in MMA who bear that suspicion out. But you are someone who I am always willing to read their work and to listen to their opinions because it's fair, and it's fair and it's honest, and I don't know how much you really see that, but please keep doing what you're doing because it's valued for people like us. It's valued from people like the Fight Site, and a lot of the people that follow our site I think are going to get a lot of mileage out of this episode, because even though it's a slightly different sort of game that you're playing, I think you have a lot of the right tools. And yeah, so just good stuff, really good stuff.
Thank you very much for that. And I would agree with a lot of what you said there about the way in which journalism is performed. And I think as we move forward with MMA, both professionally, personally, and as a sport, it's very interesting to see in which the ways media has changed and media has grown and media has retracted. I think there are a lot of developments, both in the sport and in the media of the sport, that are worth keeping an eye on. And I think analysis is the next frontier. And I think you guys are definitely spearheading that. Without you guys, I would not have any idea who the lightweight kings of ACA are. And my life would be much, much worse. I have watched so many Alexander Chablis fights during quarantine that my parents now know his name by heart.
I
That's
love
high
hearing that.
praise.
That's awesome. That's great to hear.
I just have one more question because I think this is kind of the core of what Mike was asking, other Mike, the patron Mike. And it's a lot of us are kind of frustrated by how, like, outside of those two spheres, like the general public is kind of ignorant about a lot of things. For us on the analysis side, it's just like, we go on Twitter and it kind of sucks about everything. And on the journalism side, I'm sure you'd agree that there are a lot of people who just ignore the stuff that the UFC is doing on the more unsavory side. Just in general, the promotions just being less on the up and up than one might believe. So the question I have is, where do we go from here in terms of improving the state of general knowledge? And that's like kind of a big question, but I think it's one worth looking at a little bit.
Yeah, it's definitely a question worth looking at. And I think any answer that I were to try and give would not come close to filling that gap or fully coming close to the scope of that question. But there are a lot of things, both from the analysis and journalism sides of the same coin, that can be expanded on and worked on to bring more general information. And I think one of the things for analysis is everything that you guys are doing. The depth and research that goes into your articles as a site and as a collective is pretty astounding. It's some of the best analysis I've personally seen in sport. And it's always something where I come away from it having learned something new. I watch fights in a different way as a result of the coverage you guys provide. I'm exposed to new fighters from the coverage that you guys provide. I've even started watching some boxing, which I'm not a huge boxing fan. So it shows the impact that the kind of coverage you guys can do can provide. So I think first and foremost with analysis is to continue to put out detailed, comprehensive, and thorough pieces of analysis out there for people who want to learn more about the sport. The second is about analysis is the way in which we kind of share that knowledge and bring it to a wider, perhaps more casual audience. Personally, I think the best way to do that is through video and GIF content. Obviously, social media is a big factor in the way MMA is perceived in the world. MMA Twitter is an entity in and of itself. So I think that GIF studies that I've seen a lot of you guys put out, and obviously other individuals, and video content, particularly on YouTube, is a great way to kind of bridge that gap between a casual wanting to learn more about the sport and detailed, comprehensive analysis. Because I mean, I know this firsthand, having put out plenty of pieces that the word count looks at me with a pretty confused face. Some people aren't going to sit through a lengthy article, but they will watch a video in which everything you say is about to happen does happen. It's something I've been trying to do myself with news or some of the larger pieces that we work on, trying to video format. So it's easier to consume for people who prefer that medium. And I think that video content could be the way forward as far as informing casual fans and those looking to know more about analysis.
That was a much better plug than Sriram and I could have given ourselves. Thank you, Michael.
Of course, it's
yeah,
true.
Thank you very much for coming on. I think this is a really interesting episode. And if there are, different changes that you feel in the MMA journalism sphere in the future, please reach out to us, because we'd love to have you on again and explore how things have changed, or if you find yourself in a new position, or we'd love to keep talking about this with you, because it's I think that you never really can tell with MMA. Like, as we said, it's a sport with some surprising ties, not all of which are very reputable. So having someone else's perspective who is, in a lot of ways very different from what we do, this is a very interesting one. So thank you so much, Michael. This is your chance to plug. You're at the Body Lock still, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay, you can find Michael Fiedel. I nailed it. Fiedel's work on the Body Lock and Sriram's work there, Once in a Blue Moon. For the rest of us, we are at thefightsite.com. Please stay up to date with what we're doing. We're trying to keep content rolling out as quarantine, looks like there's no real end in sight. And we'll just keep this train moving. I think on Wednesday we're gonna podcast again with our friend Julian and talk about the expectations, or what it means to be a quote unquote good fighter, which is something Sriram and I debate constantly. And for the rest of you guys, thank you so much for joining us. Stay safe and wash your hands.